glad to see everyone here again today. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here to our Honors Lecture Series on Citizenship, Immigration, and Refugees. And before we begin, I would like to thank Dean Weil for serving as our keynote speaker 2 weeks ago. I think, although I was not able to attend the lecture because I was out of town, I have watched it on YouTube, and I think that Dean Weil did an excellent job of providing us with historical contextualization and raising a lot of key issues that we'll be covering in this lecture series. So thank you, Dean Weil. At this time, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Fadzillah. Not only is a speaker in our series, but she is the person who came up with the idea for the topic this semester. She and I discussed it, and we both came up with names of people who would be appropriate speakers for the series. And as you'll learn from her biography, she's very knowledgeable about this subject area, and we're very fortunate to have her on our faculty. Dr. Fadzillah is an associate professor of anthropology here at MTSU, focusing on cultural anthropology. She received her bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College, where she double majored in anthropology and English, and went on to receive her MA in anthropology with a concentration in Southeast Asian studies from Northern Illinois University, and her PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She conducted her dissertation fieldwork in Thailand on teenage girls' life strategy narratives and focused on the cultural factors that pushed girls in one direction or another about their choices for their future. Since coming to MTSU in 2002, Dr. Fadzillah has conducted research on the immigrant communities in Middle Tennessee, on the Laotian community centered around the Buddhist temple on Old Nashville Highway, the nutrition and exercise habits of Spanish-speaking families here in Murfreesboro, and the opinions about higher education among recently resettled refugee families in Davidson and Rutherford counties. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today.
Thank you, everyone, for having me today. That was a very nice introduction, very accurate. So I am speaking to you today on immigration, refugees, and the global diaspora. And I saw my presentation today as essentially an introduction to the key terms and concepts, because I think this area of study is one that a lot of people think they know about, but they actually don't know about. There are a lot of terms that are used incorrectly, a lot of stereotypes that are incorrect, and so I wanted to use my time to lay the foundation for basically all the other talks that you're going to be hearing. All right, I always begin my presentations with a little introduction on me, because every discipline has their own approach to different topics. And so I am from cultural anthropology, and what we do in terms of gathering data is we tend to do field work. We tend to do long-term field work. So when I did my PhD dissertation field work, I was in the field for a year and a half. So I'd just gotten married. So my husband went and did his field work, and then I went and did my field work. I was in Thailand, and I was talking to teenage girls in a rural village, and my husband was doing research in Jakarta, which is, it's like Blade Runner, right? If any of you have seen that movie. Like 2 of you have, that's great, I'm happy. So my research is based on qualitative data gathering and analysis, and I am more interested in the individual's experiences than in statistical analyses. My work specifically also focuses on children and youth. I also do gender and sexuality, but right now for my research in Tennessee, I'm interested in children and children's experiences. I have also been working within a multidisciplinary project. And so we actually have Dr. Denise Bates, who's sitting right over there. She is in public health. So we have worked with people in education and in global studies and in family studies, right? And so we bring a variety of perspectives to this topic. And I think together we make our findings better, right? We all have different questions to ask. And when you bring together our conclusions, I think we give a fuller picture of the situation. I also apply an applied perspective. In anthropology, we tend to do traditional data gathering. So we go into the field, we find knowledge for knowledge's sake, and then we write it up and then we publish it. I take a more applied perspective. I think the knowledge I gather should be used to help people solve problems, make things better, right? So an applied perspective means you work in a capacity where your data is being collected and then distributed with the idea that perhaps it could be useful. Also, I have a personal perspective on the idea of immigration, refugees, and the global diaspora. I myself am an immigrant, right? I'm not a refugee. I'm not actually part of a diaspora, and I'll talk about that word a little bit more later. But I came to the United States in 1982 with my family. And I'm from Southeast Asia. I'm from Malaysia, specifically, and my dad was transferred to the United States. So I spent my years in New York City, right? And I have stayed in the United States ever since. So while this is not exactly what we're talking about today, this is actually pretty typical of Asian American experiences in the United States. There are parachute kids, that's a term that's used, where the kids get dropped off and then the parents go back home. When they retire, they leave, right? So my parents retired and they are now back in Malaysia. If you have any questions, I don't mind if you raise your hand during the talk, or at the end of the presentation, there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions also. So this is part of the reason why I'm interested in the story of immigration, right? The narrative of immigration. All right, what are immigrants? Here's one definition. They are people residing in the US who are not US citizens at birth. So this is a definition that has been used. Under this kind of definition, though, you would not just include naturalized citizens who are people who came to the United States from somewhere else and then got citizenship, right? American citizenship. It would not just include naturalized citizens or legal permanent residents or refugees, asylum seekers. It would also include people like international students, other people on temporary visas, right? So there are actually other definitions that sort of take issue with this. They make the distinction between long-term people and short-term visitors, right? So another definition of immigrant is someone who enters a foreign country with no expectation of ever returning to their home country, right? So when you see that, something that you get, I think, is the sense that immigrants' stories don't just start with their beginning, but it can also start with their end, right? Where do you see yourself growing old? Where do you see yourself being buried? Where do you see your children growing up, right? So I think that gives a fuller picture of what an immigrant is. A migrant is a category within the broadest category of immigrant. So a migrant is any person who lives temporarily or permanently in a country where they were not born, but they have acquired some significant social ties to this country. So the idea is you kind of belong, right? You're not just there long term or short term, you kind of belong, or you kind of want to stay, or you kind of have stayed. So I think the idea of temporality, like how long you have been in a place, comes into play when you think of the concept of migrant. Exile, I wanted to include this term. You don't run across a lot of exiles. That really isn't something a lot of governments are giving visas for these days, right? So an exile is a person who is expelled by the authorities of their home countries. Today, we're not really focusing on exiles. We will be focusing on migrants. At this point, also, notice that there is no illegal immigrant, illegal migrant. But these terms matter a lot in terms of legality, right? Okay. A refugee is someone who is fleeing conflict or persecution and can prove it. A lot of times, the legality or illegality is based on what papers were you able to grab, right, when you left your house. So it is very important that you have the right history, background, or papers. So papers could be your passport. It can be the visa, right, that you get to come to the United States, and it's the story that you have. An asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking international protection. These are two separate legal categories. They account for different visas that are issued. So their numbers are counted separately. But you could say the reason one group falls into one category or another category can be based on politics. It can be based on, the laws of the moment, right? Or international law at that moment. Something that is interesting is that if you are a refugee, you can't legally, based on international law, you can't get sent behind. You can't get sent out of the country, right? Once you're in the country that's accepting you, you can't be deported if you are a refugee. If you're not a refugee, there is still the chance that you can be deported, right? Undocumented immigrant, or some people say illegal immigrant. I prefer the term undocumented because essentially it is who has papers, who does not have papers. That is basically how people are being defined. So the people I work with, the people I know, we much prefer undocumented versus illegal. Because it's like saying a person is illegal, and that's not quite how human beings should get, interpreted, right? Any questions so far on these terms? I think a lot of people use these terms interchangeably, but they're different. Jennifer?
Are these terms international as well?
Yes, they're more international, probably than national, because when you are dealing with refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people, right? The first people who have to deal with that group a lot of times is not the national government, but international aid agencies. And so they have come up with a lot of these legal terms. And then they help people with their paperwork to establish at least a status of refugee, right? Okay. So you have the terms down. Don't worry, this is like a very short section. I'm not going into the history of migration, right? Hopefully someone else will talk about that. But I want to emphasize that people have been moving around the world ever since there have been communities of people, right? In anthropology, we say the earliest people probably resembled hunter-gatherers in terms of their social organization. And hunter-gatherers move all the time. The idea of borders, national borders, is a relatively new idea. And so early people would migrate, right? So the idea of humans migrating is not a new idea. It's a very, very old idea. Have all of you heard of the term diaspora? I actually think it's a very beautiful term, but it describes kind of an unbeautiful occurrence, right? So a diaspora is essentially the dispersion or spread of any people from their original homeland. And this term was first used in earnest to describe the Jewish diaspora, right, all over the globe. It comes from the Greek scattering. You have the Jewish diaspora, you have the Black diaspora, right? You have the Chinese diaspora, you have the Indian diaspora. So it's when people from one nation or region travel, right, out of their homeland. And they stay out of their homeland. They make new homes in new places. So diaspora was described in the earliest days of writing, right? You had diasporic movements of people talked about in the Bible. A much more recent movement of people was due to colonialism. So with colonialism, you had European nation states essentially traveling out from Europe and establishing new colonies, protectorates, right? All over the world, South America, Africa, Asia. Once Europeans were settled, European citizens moved en masse to a lot of these countries. So you had a lot of British who moved to Australia, right? So you did have a massive movement of people because of colonialism. They were mainly Europeans who moved out of Europe, settled down, and started their new homes, right, in other parts of the world. But also, because of colonialism, after independence, you also had another mass migration of people. It wasn't straightforwardly due to colonialism, but after colonialism ended and you had new nations forming, you also had warfare due to simmering tensions, right, between different ethnicities, between different tribes, between different religions. So you had fighting, you had violence. You also had a weak infrastructure. If a country is only 10 years old, 20 years old, or even 50 years old, you can't expect them to be able to handle certain things well, like if you had a drought, right? If you had a famine, if you had a natural disaster like earthquakes, tsunamis, right? Hurricanes, cyclones. All these things can lead to one area of one country decimated. You can have people who survived in abject poverty. They can be sick. They can be malnourished, right? They can have no job. They can have no home, literally, after these kinds of things happen. So what do, right? Before we talk about what they can do, though, remember the world that they live in. So you have these new countries, and you have this age of globalization. Within this age of globalization, we tend to take it for granted, right? But we have much faster communication. Even when I was in college, cell phones were this big, right? And they were really expensive. Getting on the internet meant calling, using your rotary, right? And then waiting 20 minutes in hopes that it caught. I don't know what the technical term is, right? But you're waiting for that sound to tell you are connected to the internet, and then you could use your Pine or whatever in those days. We had no FaceTime, right? 20 years ago, there was no free video. It's like Star Trek or something. I couldn't use my credit card outside of the United States. When you traveled outside the United States, you had to get those, money, those American Express travelers checks, and then you had to go find a bank and then trade that piece of paper for money. This sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm just mad because it's true, right? When just 20 years ago, this kind of communication, this kind of easy access to money, this kind of travel was not as easy as it is now. because things are so much easier now, you have more people traveling. You have more people affording to travel, right? And they can send money home really, really quickly. Not only do you have bodies and money and goods traveling across huge distances all over the world, you also have images of other countries traveling at super speed all over the world. You see images now of the good life, right? Or of safe places, or of good schools, or of beautiful landscapes. You see them at your fingertips. And I think with these reasons for people fleeing, coupled with images of other places, you get huge numbers of people now who are migrating, right? So here are some, they're not like super current, they're from 2015, so I think it's pretty good. But right now, 3% of the world's population lives outside their country of origin. But these are people who could be international students, right? They could be on work visas, but it's still a lot of people who are traveling. What's more interesting to me is the statistic about refugees. There are currently around 60 million refugees around the world. The number is unprecedented, right? There have never been such large numbers as this. So, according to the UNPF as the United Nations Population Fund, and then the other acronym you see, UNHCR, is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, right? So these are two UN agencies who work with these populations. So there are 60 million refugees around the world. They could be resettled, right? But the average time of displacement for refugees has now reached 20 years. So once you flee, you end up at a refugee camp, maybe, right? But before you are finally resettled into a new home, it can take 20 years. So we've actually talked to people who've been born in refugee camps, right? And they've lived there into their teens. The UNHCR has a more optimistic number. They say it only takes 17 years. But I don't know if you can imagine what a hellhole, right, a refugee camp would be. These are places where some are nicer than others, but they are not home. They are not a place that any of you would want to raise your kids in. They are not a place any of you would want to grow old in, right? They are risky places, but they are better in some respects than the places people have left. So these are kind of staggering statistics, and more than 50% of the 60 million refugees are children. All right, focusing on the US now, bringing it home a little bit, right? Those were the international statistics. The US receives about 20% of the world's international migrants. So in 2014, this represented a total of 42.4 million people in the US. It's not over 1 year, right? It is currently here in the US. Currently, immigrants account for 13.3% of the total US population. And if you take into account their kids, right, that makes up about a quarter of the overall US population.
Does that include undocumented immigrants?
This does not, the Migration Policy Institute, I think, just used the numbers that they could count, right? Right. I could be wrong, but at this point, this is basically all the people who would be documented and thus countable, right? So if you're wondering why you should care about this, this is part of the American population. These are your neighbors, right? And people you go to school with. If you think about people as, a quarter of the total US population, I think it makes it maybe easier to think of refugees and immigrants as human beings, right? People just like you who fail algebra, right? Okay. In the US, if we took 1 year, so this is like a, cross-section of 1 year. So in 2014, almost 70,000 people were admitted to the US as refugees. A separate statistic is 23,500 individuals were granted asylum, right? You remember it's a different process, different paperwork. And 55% of all admitted refugees resided in 10 states, the top 2 states, Texas and California. So Tennessee is not in like the top 10 states. So maybe it has really very little to do with us, right? However, if you look at the statistics between 2000 and 2014, the 5 states with the largest percent growth of the immigrant population, which includes refugees, asylum seekers, right? Tennessee and Kentucky are the top states. So we have a smaller refugee immigrant population, but we have a fast growing, right, population. Currently means 2013. Immigrants make up 4.7% of the Tennessee population, which accounts for over 300,000 individuals in the state, right? Now, of the 300,000 individuals, a third are naturalized US citizens. They have American citizenship. Out of that number in 2013, approximately 60,000 were refugees. They are on that specific visa type. So there are a lot of different types, right, of statuses, visa statuses you could have. I keep jumping back and forth between immigrants and refugees. At this point, though, you should be able to jump with me, right, between the different terms. Okay. Here's a breakdown. It's from 2012.
Sorry, on the previous slide, it mentions refugees and that in Tennessee, and that's a similar number to refugees in the country.
Right.
Was the refugees in the country a per year number and the 60,000 number of ones that are everyone who's living in Tennessee?
Exactly. So the first number is how many was accepted in the United States over the course of 1 year. And then the 60,000 in Tennessee is currently, this is the number that we have in the state. That's right. So here's a 2012 breakdown of where refugees are being resettled. 75% in Nashville, right? A lot of them are actually currently being resettled in Rutherford County, but in the Smyrna area, not the Murfreesboro area. 12% in Knoxville, 9% in Memphis, 4% in Chattanooga. In 2012, the main countries of origin were Iraq, Burma, or Myanmar, if you wish to call it Myanmar, which I think the US government now officially calls it Myanmar. 18% from Bhutan, 17% from Somalia. I would think this year and next year, probably Syrians would be up there. But in 2012, they were a very small percentage of the refugees because it takes around 2 years to get your paperwork in to be even considered for resettlement in a secondary country. So at that point, right, it wasn't that far along in the trajectory for Syrian refugees. I think it is now. So Tennessee should pay careful attention to this population. I want to stress they are here legally, right? The US government brought them here. A lot of times you gain refugee status because you helped the American military back in your country of origin. One of the largest waves of refugees came from Vietnam, and they were Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, who helped the US government. And if they stayed in Vietnam, they would have been killed, right? So the reason a lot of refugees come to the United States is because they were allies. They were the ones who actually helped people on the ground. This is actually my last slide, but I wanted you guys to also know because we have such a huge percentage of our population be refugees, we also have a lot of problems with trying to help them resettle. There are three main groups that have been contracted by the US government to help in the resettlement process. One is Catholic Charities, one is NICE, which stands for Nashville International Center for Empowerment. And then the third one, I always forget because I want to say World Outreach, but that's not it. What is it? World Relief. World Relief. And so we have offices in Nashville that work with recently resettled refugees. They work with them from like picking them up at the airport to driving them to their first house, showing them how the lights work, right? Helping them sign their kids up for school because kids legally have to be in school. So they do all this stuff, but their work is, it's limited. Like it's only for a certain amount of time. And then these people have to figure out how to succeed on their own. Refugees also don't come here completely unscarred. Physically, they might look fine, though a lot of them are not okay physically, right? But they have experienced trauma to the extent that most of us would not even be able to imagine. So they have PTSD, they suffer from depression, right? Some of the kids have never been in a school, so they don't know how to behave in elementary school, middle school, high school. A lot of the kids don't know how to read or write. So these are issues that push your county to the limit, right? Hospitals have to learn how to handle this population in a sensitive and successful way. And so does schools, right? So does healthcare. So does the law. All these places have to figure out how to help these people. And it takes a bit of work. And this is one of the reasons there are actually quite a few MTSU professors who are working with this population. And they're trying to figure out, I guess I should say, we are trying to figure out the needs that they have and then ways we can meet those needs, right? And it's not easy because there is the language barrier and then there is a cross-cultural barrier. You might know the language, but how you say things, how you present yourself, how you greet people, it's complicated. I mean, I think we have problems ourselves just saying it to our roommate, right? And getting our point across. But you have to tell them, you know, their kids can't be running around in the winter wearing just flip-flops and t-shirts, right? Because, you know, child services will be called. But how are they supposed to know that, right? If they've been living in a refugee camp. How are they supposed to know what you're supposed to wear? What are you supposed to wear to school? We all know this because we were born here or at least raised here. But when you come here from another country under circumstances of violence and brutality and trauma, these are things you really have to figure out how to present well, right? And I think a lot of the faculty here, we are trying to figure out how to interact and offer our help to these populations well. Does anyone have any questions?
So it sounds kind of like the applied anthropology perspective has a lot of social work background to it.
It has social work, it has public health, it has education. Like a lot of our anthropologists work with school systems to try and figure out how, right now we're trying to figure out how to get better parent-teacher interactions, right? Because with a lot of refugee communities, parents say, here's my child, right? And then send the kid back educated. But that's not how we work. That's not how the school system works here. It might work that way in other countries, but that's not how it works here. And so the communication, do you see, goes beyond language? So actually there are a lot of anthropologists who are in education too, who try and figure out how to help foster better communication.
When you do your research research? Do you like write a paper and publish it?
A lot of times it depends on who's funding the research. Usually we write reports. And then if we have access to our own data, which we always try to have access to that, then we try to also publish a paper or a book. Yeah.
So can you kind of go back to the, you said it differently, but I've been taught it was diaspora. Because like the definition was kind of vague, and I feel like colonialism it can fall under the diaspora. However, I feel like when I hear the word diaspora, I'm thinking of not the choice, not the decision.
Yes.
So, and you can choose to be, I mean, like, they move necessarily, not
They were forced.
here. Yeah.
Right. There are lots of academics and writers who use that term in one way or another, right? The ones that I have read have used the diaspora to capture almost a kind of sadness in the movement. So there is, I know this is like literary or something, but actually a lot of the writers I've read were not anthropologists. So I think there is the idea that there is a force to it, so the Jewish diaspora. I have heard it used with the Black diaspora. There is the idea that there is a sadness in the travel, right? And that the travel goes all over the world. And that people stay away, but they still have the connection, right? In their imagination and in their nostalgia. It's like a memory, but it's like a learned memory, right? Over the generations of the homeland. So when I think of diaspora, I think of it more like that, more almost like of a literary experience of it. It's not a legal term. Like when we talk about refugees, immigrants, migrants, a lot of those things are like the legal definition, right? Diaspora is more of an artistic, right? More of a haunting way to describe the movement of a nation, right? Any other questions? You, and then you.
You mentioned that there were a lot of refugees, and it's difficult to deal with all of them, but your numbers up there say that there were only 1,376 in 2012. When you say a lot, you mean relative to the resources available?
Yes. Yes, thank you for clearing that up. I mean, what is 75% of 1376? Anyone? Quick. None of you? None of you can do that? What?
700.
Okay, so let's say 700 were placed in Nashville in 1 year, right? Trying to incorporate 700 new kids into the school system is a nightmare, right? This is on top of the regular growth that you're expecting or you're predicting. So it is that it's a lot for certain institutions to handle, but they handle it. They handle it.
I was just wondering, you mentioned that it takes about 2 years for an application for refugee status to get approved, and I was just wondering if you know statistically how often they even get approved.
Not very often. That accounts, I think, for the at least 20-year wait to go somewhere, right? From there. Denise, are you going to say something?
I was just going to say 1%. 1% gets approved.
So what happens to the other people who don't get approved for resettlement?
Actually, the majority of our refugees who are internally displaced are in cities. The difference, and probably not wanting to go into grand depth because of all the speakers that come, but if you're in a country that's designated by the UN as a refugee country, it's in active war, then you get permission to access refugee camps that are sponsored by UN, and then you can apply for that process. Of those people who are in those camps, only 1% get approved to go to the US or other countries, the other 9 countries that we settle. The majority of the people are not in countries that are actually approved by the UN because they're not in active war countries, but those are countries that are living in persecution every single day. And so we see lots and lots of migration, like from Nigeria. We see Sierra Leone still, we see Ethiopia, we see a lot of countries that don't get permission for refugee status. So they live internal cities. Like I work a lot in Kenya, and a lot of the slum areas there are filled with political asylees that are trying to flee their country because it's under persecution, but they're not going to get refugee status. So it's pretty tragic when you think about the large numbers of people that are out, and then only 1% of them get approved in the long run. So very small.
The other thing I've read recently is also, if you're a victim of drought or famine, or natural disasters, you're not necessarily automatically qualified for refugee status, right? So right now there is actually active debate about making people who are coming from these places that have been wiped out by a natural disaster be able to receive refugee status.
I've heard the term economic migrant thrown about. Would those be considered economic migrants, at least until the definition?
I think yes. Which is kind of funny because in the end, everyone, is pitifully poor, right? Desperately poor. But that is not grounds for refugee status.
So if a country was to learn that the refugees or these people were actively seeking to be a refugee somewhere else, they're in danger, right? Okay.
Usually they're in danger first, and then they seek asylum or, refugee status in another country.
If somebody was to find out that they were doing that they were actively pursuing to be a refugee somewhere else, because you're saying only 1% gets in, so those other people, something happens to them, is what I'm saying.
Yes. So it is like dire straits for everyone else, right? Like it is a very dangerous situation.
So if you have to go through this whole 2-year process to get refugee status, at least, and only 1% get accepted for resettlement, all the others, how do you have undocumented people if it's so difficult to get accepted?
The undocumented tend to not come through the refugee system, and they don't come through necessarily the asylum system. They cross borders on their own without the proper papers, like visa, for example, or they outstay their visa. So they come on a student visa or a tourist visa, and then they outstay the date that's stamped on the visa. But, one of the things the U.S. has been seeing is this huge surge in undocumented asylum seekers at the border with Mexico, right? And a lot of them are kids, a lot of them are minors, and they're unaccompanied. So their status, once they cross in, they are kind of officially seeking asylum, but that's a way, right, at that border, people can pass through without the proper papers and then be considered undocumented. It's funny that it comes down a lot of times to stamps, right? Like in your passport. You need a passport that's valid, you need a stamp that's valid. But these terms, for the most part, have arisen out of trying to keep borders tight, right? National borders impermeable. And the way we do that is not necessarily with fences, but with the right stamp on the passport.
Or a wall, like
Try. We could try. There was the Great Wall of China.
Stop the Mongols, didn't it?
Sure. I also want to tell you all, I hope this is an okay forum to announce this, but my department, Sociology and Anthropology, every year has a symposium for undergrads, right? And it has a different theme every year. And this year's theme is Immigration and Refugees. So if you're interested in this topic, we're going to have some really cool speakers and panels. And I think we always have honors students presenting on their honors thesis if they are interested. But if you want me to email you the link for submitting an abstracts, just talk to me after the meeting before you go grab your ice cream, right? And I'll write it down and then I'll email you the link. But we're going to have, I think it'll be very interesting. It's October 20th and 21st, which is a Thursday and a Friday. And it's going to be at the Student Union, and it's free. It's free for everybody. Does anyone have any other questions on this? You?
So you said that only 1% gets in, but, I'm sorry. You said that only 1% gets in, but what type of means are in place for them when they get here? I get that they have the sort of helpers, but financially, how economically are they helped? Are they given money, or you may be able to answer this?
So the process quickly goes like this. If they get qualified in an official refugee camp by the UNHCR, you saw the term there, then they go through a series of interviews, lots and lots and lots of interviews, and then they determine from those interviews the 1% that are accepted to come in, particularly to the U.S. Once the State Department determines the number of people they're willing to take, then those are designated to come to the U.S. Once the State Department identifies those folks, they're now willing to pay for their trip over, but the refugees have to, in turn, pay that back. So when we talk support, it's kind of a touch and go for a number of their areas of support. So their flight is paid for initially, but it's on loan. So they pay $10,000 per head for the ability to come to the U.S. and they sign a contract that they will pay that back to the United States government within 10 years. So they have 10 years to do that. Once they arrive here, they have 8 months of support. So they support their families for 30 days until they get their Social Security cards. They're then supported for 8 months solely for medical care. The agencies have 8 months of support to help them get settled in, get them in English classes, those kinds of things. That is done by 10, what we call VOLACs. They're volunteer agencies, all of those VOLACs are faith-based agencies. And so Catholic Charities, World Relief, they have a big umbrella, but there are also 8 more. And then they have local agencies. And then once the VOLACs get together, they say, we'll take 2,000, we'll take 1,000, and then they get distributed to their local agencies. So here in our area, we have Catholic Charities, World Relief, and NICE, the National International Center for Atonement. And those 3 agencies receive total in Nashville about 700 to 800 people per year in the Nashville area. So that's the process.
Thank you.
Oh, my question was about when undocumented immigrants have children in the U.S. and they're technically not documented still, but they are U.S. citizens, so they were born here.
If you're born here, you're a U.S. citizen.
Right. But they don't have paperwork to prove that or what not. So what categories do they fall in the families? And
Usually if you're born in the U.S., you will have the paperwork.
okay.
If you're born in the hospital, they will give you, if you're not born in the hospital, I think most people are born in the hospital. I'm just going to make this easy on myself.
Okay.
I think, but it doesn't change the status of the parents, right?
Right.
Just of the child.
So like will they like report them?
They might. But neighbors might, or there are deportations that happen all the time, but not of the kid. So we have heard stories from people from here who they've gone home and their parents are gone. Like they've walked home from school and their parents are gone. It sounds like I'm trying to, shock you, but this is what happens if you have a mixed family, right? If the
Situations too, like I have a good friend of mine who was brought here when he was 4 with his parents, and his family ended up having to go back, but he's still here, he's a dreamer. So he's going through that process, but he's kind of in between because he was raised here. He feels like the U.S. is where he belongs, but
When they are deciding who to let in or who to give refugee status to, do they always give, if they give one person in a family status, do they give the entire family refugee status?
I don't think so. Do you know, Denise?
They basically will give only 18 and under dependents. So what we see is a lot of families come in groups, those that are still intact. But if they, for instance, any of you in here, if you were qualified, you would have to go through your separate qualification process. So your parents may get in, and your younger brothers and siblings, but you might not get in. So we see families split up quite often, actually.
But if they like give a mother or father, do they always give the spouse?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and a lot of times dependent grandparents as well. But we see that the older children are always, they're split off a lot, which is really unfortunate.
Please join me in thanking